guys, so today we are going to be making our crazy cupcake recipe. What makes this recipe crazy is that you're going to take a basic cake batter and we're actually going to divide it out into 3 different bowls, and we are going to flavor those with a couple different flavors so that we end up with 4 cupcakes of each of the 3 flavors. So let's get to it. For this particular recipe, we need 1 cup of sugar, 1 cup of butter softened, 4 eggs, 1 2/3 cup of all-purpose flour, or you can use cake flour. If you recall from reading through the notes or from conversations we've had before, we talked about cake flour having a lower protein content, so that makes a little bit more of a tender cupcake. Most people are used to eating all-purpose, so it's not a big deal if you don't have cake flour available at your house. And then 1 teaspoon of baking powder, and then 2 tablespoons of milk. If for some reason you didn't have milk available, there's some alternate options. You could just use water. You could use almond milk. There are some other types of milk that you could use to substitute. So because it's such a small quantity, ideally use milk, but if you had to make a substitution, there's some reasonable things you could do. So first thing we'll do is preheat our oven, which we've already got going. We have 350 for that. This recipe asks you to line a cupcake tray with liners, but we don't have cupcake liners. So if you're ever making a recipe and it has you lining it with a piece of paper and you don't have that, the assumption is that you do need to grease the inside of that pan. The liners are kind of the barrier to keep the food from sticking, and if you're not using that, you need to create that barrier. So we've got cooking spray, we've got our 12-cup cupcake liner, so we will get that sprayed and ready to go and set that off to the side. You want to be very careful when you're spraying cooking spray anywhere because it does kind of spray over. If you're doing it over a floor, be careful that it's not greasy and you don't fall. Typically, I'll do it over a sink. In the lab where we work, sometimes we'll do it over the garbage can so that it kind of falls into that. So just be cautious. You don't want to overdo it, just enough to keep things from sticking. You shouldn't see the grease dripping through each of the cupcake sections. So as long as you just get a nice thin layer, you're good to go. All right, so let's move on. We are going to use a stand mixer. Again, if you don't have a stand mixer at home, you can do these things by hand. It just takes a little bit more muscle and a little bit work, and sometimes you may have to mix it for a longer period of time to get everything to incorporate. So this one says, in a stand mixer fitted with the whisk attachment, beat your butter until light and fluffy. So if you recall, it said we needed 1 cup of butter softened, and we should know that 1 cup is 8 ounces. We should know that each stick is 4 ounces or a half a cup. So in order to get our 1 cup, we are going to need 2 sticks of butter. Remember, the assumption is unsalted butter. So if you are using salted butter, just know that you'll have a little bit of an extra salty flavor in your recipe. So we've got our 1 cup of butter, and he's getting rid of the liner in the back. From there, we are going to beat this until it is light and fluffy. So I'm going to put this down, lock my mixer in place, and just start it on low. Get it going and let it get a little bit fluffy. It should lighten in color. I do crank it up to the highest speed towards the end to really get that butter to fluff nicely. You want to have light, airy cake. All right, so I'm gonna unlock this and take it off so you can get a look at what that is. So you'll see it's pretty light and fluffy inside of there. The color of the butter is actually lightened up a little bit because we've incorporated some air, so that's what you're going for. All right. I'm gonna take a spatula and scrape down the sides because it's always a good habit. All right, so what's next on our list?
I'm using number 3.
Step number 3.
Add your sugar and cream together, the sugar and butter, until light and pale in color.
All right, so we are going to add our sugar in and cream that with this until everything is nice and fluffy and pale in color. For the sugar, we are going to need 1 cup or 8 ounces of sugar. So we are actually going to weigh it since they've given us a weight. So I'm going to get out my trusty scale. I'm going to grab a bowl. We're going to put that on the scale. We are going to turn this on.
How much do we need?
We're gonna set it to ounces instead of grams since that's what the recipe calls for. And we are gonna measure out 8 ounces of sugar. 4 ounces, halfway there. Almost there. So we have our 8 ounces of sugar, so we're gonna add that into our mixture and we're gonna beat it till it's nice and light and fluffy. All right, so here we go. All right, so it looks like it's nice and light and fluffy. I'm gonna move this out of the way so I can show you. Scrape down the sides a little bit. Again, you want it to incorporate really nicely. It's gonna get a nice pale color. It's gonna look fluffy. You can probably see it on the little mixing whisk. So there you go, nice fluffy mixture, ready to go. So very similar to a cream mixture that you would make for a cookie. It's that sugar and fat blending together so that they look like all one ingredient and they look fluffy. All right, so next we are gonna add in our eggs one at a time, being sure they're fully incorporated between each one, and then add our milk. So this recipe calls for 4 eggs. It's a pretty significant amount of eggs. So we will add those one at a time. So if you're going to go ahead and we're going to crack them each into a separate bowl. We want to make sure that they're not damaged or bloody or we get any eggshells in there. So we want to do it. Well, that didn't go so well. So that happens, not a big deal. That's why it's always good to keep some extra eggs. And I think we might actually be able to save this since we're working on a nice clean counter. I'm not too worried about anything from the counter, impacting the recipe. Look at that, saved. Let's clean up our mess, especially since it's raw egg. We want to make sure that we don't have that all over our countertop as we're working. And probably want to give your hands a wash too if you get egg on them. All right, we're back from washing our hands and cleaning up our space. So we are going to add this one in. While I'm adding that egg, he'll crack the next one. We'll add our second egg. We got a little bit of shell in this one, so I'm going to try to grab it. Perfect. And there's egg number 4. Make sure that everything from the bowl gets in there. Don't forget to scrape down. Remember that little lip on the bottom of your stand mixer? Make sure you get that in case anything's stuck in there. If you're doing this by hand or with a hand electric mixer, you don't have to worry about that. Do this quickly so it doesn't drip. You'll see, nice fluffy batter. So from here, we are going to add in the milk, which is 2 tablespoons. Okay. So there's our 2 tablespoons of milk, and we'll add that in. Dishes in the sink. All right, excellent. So from here, it says we're going to add our dry ingredients and mix until a smooth batter is formed. Do not overmix. So we have to go back up to the top of the recipe and check out what our dry ingredients are and get those measured out. So for our dry ingredients, we need 1 2/3 cup or 8 ounces of all-purpose flour, 1 teaspoon of baking powder. So again, because there is a measurement, we are going to weigh our flour, but if you weren't, you could use your measuring cup. So you'd have your 1 cup, and then you'd measure 1/3 of a cup twice to get the 2/3. Basic math. All right, so let's get our flour. Swap pieces. Go ahead, grab that. And again, we're going for 8 ounces.
Again.
So we went a little over, no big deal. We can easily scoop a little out and put it back in until we get to the 8 ounces since we haven't mixed anything else in. Perfect, there we go, 8 ounces. So from here, we're going to add that into the mix, but I think what we'll do is put our baking powder in here first. So this is crazy. A friend of mine ordered and accidentally got this giant thing of baking powder from Amazon and gifted it to me. And I was planning to bring it to school because I figured, hey, who else would use this quantity but a school? But here we are stuck at home, so we're making some use of it while we're baking here. So we need 1 teaspoon of baking powder. So for this, just a nice teaspoon, and then we have our leveling spatula. Okay, so we take our teaspoon. I'm just using the back of a regular old butter knife. We level off our 1 teaspoon. I'm going to mix that in. And then we will add that into our mixture. So we want to add just a little bit at a time as we're going so that it doesn't go flying everywhere. So I'm going to add a little, stir it up, add a little, stir it up, and continue that process until it's all incorporated. So I'm going to scrape down the bowl a little bit. Again, always something to do in the middle of your mixing. Stick it on and mix a little bit more until it's fully incorporated. So our mix is good. We've got a nice batter going. You can see it kind of glopping down here. I'll do a quick little tip. So it looks just like a cake batter. This is a little thicker than a box mix. If you're used to using box mix batter, you're gonna find that it's definitely a little bit thicker, but it gives a nice fluffy cupcake at the end. So let's take a look at our recipe and just double check everything. So add the dry ingredients, mix until there's a smooth batter form. Do not over mix. So again, we've talked about this. Flour has gluten. If you over mix your batters, you will develop that gluten and you will end up with tough and chewy. It's one of the reasons that a lot of people use cake flour because it's got a lower gluten content, so you're less likely to get that chewiness and overdevelop it. So I have mixed this just enough so that it is incorporated and no more than that. The other piece of this is we are gonna flavor this batter, and we wanna make sure that when we flavor it, that we don't end up over mixing it then as well. So we're gonna be very cautious about our mixing of that. All right, so it says to flavor your cupcakes, you're gonna divide the batter into thirds. The batter should weigh 30 ounces, so 10 ounces for each bowl. Again, you know, it depends on how accurately you measured. So we're gonna try to see if 10 ounces works for us, and we'll kind of go from there. It's just a close enough kind of a thing. So for our flavors, we are going to do an Oreo cupcake. We are going to do a red velvet cupcake, and we are gonna do a lemon poppy seed cupcake. And then I think we're gonna do that ermine flour frosting that we did when we made our whoopie pies, because we really like that flavor. We don't want anything that's too overly sweet. So, okay. So we've got 3 mixing bowls. Which one do you wanna start with?
Let's go red velvet.
Red velvet first. So on the recipe, if I'm gonna scroll down on my iPad over here, if you scroll down towards the bottom of this recipe, there's a carrot cake, chocolate and peanut butter cake, lemon and blueberry, birthday cake, and red velvet. So these add-ins are basically the add-ins that you would do for that 1/3 of the batter. If I believe. I might have to go back and rewatch her video. So we are going to take our batter, and this is where, even though it's got some raw egg, you could take a tasting spoon and just make sure that the flavor is where you want it to be. Some of it might just be visual, so we're gonna kind of go for it. So it says 1/2 tablespoon of cocoa powder, some red food coloring, doesn't tell you how much, it's just enough to make it look red velvet. But we're going for how many ounces, Sam, do you remember? 10 ounces, so let's turn on that. We're gonna knock off our excess batter here and then get weighing. All right, so let's get our 10 ounces measured out. And keep watch for me. So ours came to 10.1. I'm not gonna fight over that 0.1, it's too much work, so we're just gonna leave it like it is. We're gonna measure out our other two before we flavor it in case we need to make some adjustments. We wanna make sure that all the bowls are equal, because equal size bowls means that we'll have equal amounts of batter going into the tin, which means they're all gonna bake equally, so. Remember to zero it out before you get started so you can make sure that the bowl is not counted in the weight. So we ended up with 10.2, so I added just a smidgen and a smidgen to that, so they're probably about the same thing, close to the 10.2. So pretty good. Not bad in terms of making that nice accurate measure that the recipe called for. All right, so for the red velvet, we said that we needed a 1/2 tablespoon of cocoa powder and some red food coloring. So I'm actually remembering a little bit back, and I think I gave you some misinformation. If I recall, I believe these measurements might be for 1 cupcake. So you know what, we're gonna see how this goes. And that's the thing about recipes, is you wanna make sure you know what you're getting into. So if you're unsure, you can always go back and look. We're gonna wing it and see how this goes. So there's our 1/2 tablespoon. I'm gonna drop that in there. I have a feeling we're gonna need to add 2 more, but let's see how this goes. So we can get our scale out of the way. And what we're gonna do is just stir this in. So I can tell just by looking at this that it's not gonna be very dark chocolate, so I'm gonna say that that amount was for 1 cupcake. So what would we do if we wanted to make more than that? We would add additional. So our goal right now is to make 12 full cupcakes. If we're dividing by 3, this is gonna be 4 cupcakes. So then I'm gonna need to multiply that by 4. So a 1/2 tablespoon times 4 would be 2 full tablespoons. So I'm gonna add 3 more to get to our full tablespoon. Now if I had a tablespoon measure over here, I would use that, but I don't. So this is what we're gonna go for. Now, what can sometimes happen with this batter, because you're adding cocoa and it is a dry ingredient, is it can feel a little bit dry. If you feel like it's too dry and you need to add to it, then you can go ahead and do that with just a smidgen of water or milk. But be very careful. Again, when you start messing with ratios, you start impacting the texture and the flavor of the cake. So just be careful. Again, be very careful when you're mixing. You don't want to over mix, so try to incorporate it as best you can, as quickly as you can. Sometimes you'll see I'm kind of folding it in instead of stirring it, which actually is a better way to mix things in. All right, So there we go. That looks a little bit more chocolate now. So in order to make red velvet, all it is basically red food coloring that you add to chocolate cake. Simple. A lot of people think it's something fancy and it's not really. So unfortunately we have no red dye in our house, so we are going to make it up and we're gonna try pink and see if we can get this to turn to a nice red color. So you wanna add that? Why don't we start with 2 drops and let's see how that goes. Red is typically a pretty strong color, so you don't usually need a lot. Go 2 more. 1 drop for each cupcake. So I think because this is pink, we have to add a little bit more than we probably would with the red. And that's what experimentation is about. Again, trying to be cautious not to overmix it, but trying to get it mixed in well. So as you can see, we've got like a red chocolatey color going on here. So I'd say that we're pretty good on our red velvet cupcake. And the consistency looks pretty similar to what we had with our other batters. The addition of those liquid drops probably helped with the dry cocoa. So I think we're just gonna let it be and not mess with the consistency. Okay. So we'll set that off to the side and go for our next flavor. So which one should we do next?
Let's go lemon poppy seed.
All right, so he wants to go lemon poppy seed. Now this one is not listed on the recipe. So we kind of just came up with this on our own. So again, this is gonna be a little bit of an experiment in terms of how much we add of things. Always start little, you can always increase it, but if you go overboard, you can't take it back. So we definitely wanna make sure that we are careful about what we add. So we've got poppy seeds here, and I actually have pure lemon extract. Now in the recipe, there is a lemon blueberry cupcake that they mentioned, and it has you putting in a tablespoon of lemon zest for the actual thing, but I don't have any real lemons in my house right now, so we're gonna experiment with the pure lemon extract. Because it is pure extract, we're gonna err on the cautious side. I'm thinking we should probably try like maybe a half a teaspoon. Why don't you go grab us a half a teaspoon? And then for the poppy seeds, again, I would say we'll try maybe a tablespoon of poppy seeds and see how that works, and go from there. So can you grab us a tablespoon as well? I happen to love lemon poppy seed, and I like my lemon flavor pretty strong, so that's why we're gonna try the half teaspoon. Okay, you ready?
You don't like it like that.
Beautiful.
Ooh.
You can smell the lemon.
That is pretty.
Take a spoon. Again, we're gonna mix this in. And because there are raw eggs, we want to be careful about batter tasting, but sometimes you gotta take one for the team to see if it tastes the way you want it to taste. So I am going to take a taste of this, even though there's some raw batter. I'll let my sidekick here take a taste as well, see what he thinks about it, and we'll go from there. What do you think? More lemon? Maybe a little more? I think it needs a little more.
Yeah. I don't know if we need a whole.
I like lemon.
I don't know if we need a whole. That's good.
The poppy seed ratio seemed pretty perfect. So, because we've tasted with that spoon, we do not want to stick that spoon back in the batter again to taste with, so we want to use a clean spoon or wash that one. Again, that cross-contamination, we don't want to add our germs from our mouth back into the food. It's why we use tasting spoons. It's not why we don't stick our fingers in things and then back and forth. Much better. Yep, much better. We got a nice lemon flavor in there, so that's perfect. All right, so our lemon poppy seed is done. So on to our last one. What's our last one?
Oreos.
Oreo! So, having done this many times with other students in other semesters, we have learned that sometimes the filling of the Oreo impacts the cake itself. So, Oreo filling is made from fat and sugar, and we all know fat and sugar impacts the texture and the tenderness, and can even impact kind of the liquid part of that when that fat kind of, liquefies when it gets into the heat. So, what I recommend when you do this is to take some of that filling out from the Oreos that you were gonna actually put into your mix. So this one calls for 2 crushed Oreo cookies. We have 5 here. So we are probably gonna take the center out of, I would say, probably half the cookies. Too small bowl for that.
Can I eat them?
Now, what you choose to do with that icing, totally up to you. So what I'm gonna do is put the ones that are scraped off back into this bag with the other 2 that still have the icing in them. Because there is a flavor in that icing that's kind of nice to add that gives it that Oreo. And crushing Oreos is pretty simple. You can just take your fist and kind of smash them. You just want to be careful that the bag doesn't split open. You can just go ahead and put that off to the side. Oh, you're gonna eat it? All right, there you go. You can also take something a little rounder than a knife. You could use like the back of a measuring cup. Okay. You can even just crush it in your hands.
You use the big hammer then.
Yeah, if you have a meat cleaver, or not a cleaver, but it's like a tenderizer. Usually it has a flat side. You can use that flat side to kind of crush things up.
You don't want to use the sharp side.
You don't want to use the sharp side. Nope, that will cut holes into the bag.
What about the meat one? That one for me.
So, again, it was 2 Oreo cookies per cake. I only had 5 Oreos. It's close enough to 6. All right, so.
I crushed them up a lot, so
I don't want them too crushed because it's nice to have that little bit of chunk or that little bit of crunch in your mix. So, pour that in. Doesn't that look delicious? So as tempting as it is to taste this one, we don't need to taste it. We all know what Oreos taste like, and you can kind of look visually and see that it is littered with lots of Oreo crumbs, so it's gonna be sufficient. Wah wah. All right, you wanna throw that out?
Sure.
Okay, so we have successfully added all of our flavors. It says that we are going to bake these for 16 to 18 minutes, but we need to get them in the pan first. So I'm gonna bring back our pan. I am going to just use the spoons that I have in there to scoop them in. You could use a cookie scoop if you wanted. You basically are looking to get as much equal amounts of batter into your tray as possible. I always recommend when you're baking multiple flavors to pick the rows in this way so you don't forget which flavor is which. Sometimes the flavors change color as they bake and you might lose track of what's what, especially if you have things that are similar. Ours are pretty obviously different, but we want to use our rows. So we're just gonna scoop and try to get it into the pan. This is gonna fill pretty far. Now remember, we did add mix-ins to our batter, and that impacts the size of the batter and the quantity. So you may find that you have a little left over depending on what size your cupcake tins are. You want to fill them about 3/4 of the way full. So sometimes too, what I'll just do is kind of mash it down in there to fill in those spaces. have a little bit of batter left, but not a ton. And you can see that we filled our cupcakes 3/4 of the way, maybe even a little bit more than that, but I think they're gonna be just fine. So we're gonna take our next one, lemon poppy seed, do the same thing. So that one actually was perfect. We used pretty much all the batter and we filled them about 3/4 of the way. So our next one is our red velvet. So as it sat, the red is actually absorbed a little bit more and it does deepen. So that is pretty common with red food coloring or anything in the red family. The longer it sits, kind of the deeper the darker. So, you know, sometimes you might want to give it a minute to settle before you start adding more color to make it dark. So same thing with that, we ended up with just enough to fill it up. So again, a lot of it is dependent on the add-ins that you're putting in there because the cookie gives a lot of volume and bulk. We ended up with more batter than we needed. So what I recommend before you throw things into the oven is to clean up any drips or any smears or any messes that you kind of made. So I've got a few little spots. I'm just gonna kind of grab that with my finger, wipe it off. That prevents it from burning on there and baking and making it more difficult to clean up. So just a little trick and tip for you. No licking fingers. So hard. All right, so there we go. You can even give them just a little tap to settle them in. These are gonna bake for 16 to 18 minutes. Again, depending on the mix-ins that you put in, sometimes that's gonna impact the bake time. So that can be challenging if, let's say you put blueberries into one and the blueberries with the wetness actually take a little longer to bake, but yet maybe you had red velvet in there, which has a tendency to dry out faster. So that is where cupcake liners can be really helpful because if some are done baking before others, you can pull those right out with their liner and then stick the others back in. It's a little bit more challenging when you don't have a liner. So we are gonna pop these in the oven and we will see you guys in a little bit. So guys, while the ermine frosting is getting itself settled in the sandwicher, turn that off so you don't have to listen. You can see our cupcakes are done, they're out. One of the ways that you can test them is by tapping them and they should spring back. If they don't spring back and they sink in, then they probably need a little bit more time. We've got a nice little golden color around the outside edges of them and they look nicely baked. So I'm pretty excited to get these frosted. So we are gonna let these cool for a little bit, a few minutes in the pan, and then we are going to go around the outside edge with a knife to kind of loosen them and then take them and put them on a cooling rack and let them finish cooling. If you leave them in the pan too long, it can get challenging to get them out. So you definitely wanna make sure that you take them out after they've cooled in the pan for a little bit of time. For the icing recipe that we are going to use, if you recall, we did an ermine icing with our whoopie pies. So I'm not going to demo that again, but you can have access to that if you watch the whoopie pie recipe and just kind of skip ahead to the end where that frosting is. I'm letting my flour mixture cool from that, and then I whipped up my butter and my sugar so it's nice and pretty light and fluffy. It whips for a solid 5 minutes. I'm gonna add that additional flour mixture into this and then whip that up and get our icing, and then we will probably flavor and decorate in some way. All right guys, so we let our cupcakes cool. We whipped up our ermine icing, Hungarian flour frosting, whatever you wanna call it. We went with kind of a lavendery, pinky purple color, just a vanilla flavor, something very simple so you can taste the deliciousness of the cupcakes. So this is what we call a piping bag or an icing bag. A lot of people do not have these at their house. You can use a regular old Ziploc plastic bag for decorating. The key to filling any sort of bag, whether it's just a Ziploc bag that you're using at home or an actual icing bag, and there are disposable versions of these you can get at Michael's and sometimes at the grocery store, is the way you fill it. So the trick to keeping it from oozing all out the top and you getting greasy hands and making a mess is folding it down. So at the top, you want to fold down the top of your bag so that you have this little lipped edge that you can stick your hand in. And that little lipped edge kind of helps you hold the bag open so that you can very gently put the icing into the bag. Now, I am not going to use any sort of decorating tip on this. This bag comes with a pre-cut opening in it, and it's kind of a nice wide hole, so it'll give me a nice round swirl that I can do on here. Large tips are typically better for making those kind of big, pretty swirls that you usually see on cupcakes. Unfortunately, all of mine are at school, so here we are. So we're kind of making do with what we got. So I am going to grab this, and I'm going to take my spatula, and we're going to fill.
So you did it pink?
So when you fill, you basically want to try to get as much of that icing in there, and you don't want to overdo the bag because if you put too much icing in there, it's going to be too hard to hold and it's just going to ooze everywhere. So once you've gotten in what you think is a decent amount of icing, you just quickly take that and fold it up. And then from there, you'll see that now my top edge is all nice and clean. You can see where the icing kind of starts down here. I'm going to squeeze that down towards the bottom until I start to create some pressure in there, and you'll see that it's kind of pressurizing the bag and my icing is just about ready to come out. The way you grip a bag is really important. Most people are double grippers. They like to squeeze it with both of their hands, and what that does is the warmth of your hands actually warms up the icing and can cause it to get thin. And it's really not the proper technique for icing. You're using really one hand as your squeeze hand, and then your other hand is just kind of guiding the icing bag where you want it to go depending on the decoration that you're making. Now there's all sorts of tutorials and videos out there. Wilton, who is a very well-known company for cake decorating, has tons of decorating ideas and videos that you can watch, so you feel free to experiment and check those out, but I'm just going to show you the basics of actually using a bag, and they have videos on this as well. So what you kind of want to do is gather your bag together, kind of like a pincher grip, think like lobster claw, and you're going to grab your bag like that, and then you're going to give it a twist, and what that twist does is creates pressure. Also prevents the icing from oozing back out the top. Now what a lot of people like to do is fold the top of the bag over after they've twisted and hold it. And I do see some professionals that do that. The problem with that is as the icing is coming out, you start losing pressure. And so it's really hard to squeeze the bag and to get it to come out the way you want. You always have to maintain that pressure, and the way you do that is by constantly twisting. But if the bag is folded over, I can't twist it. But if I have a grip like this, I can always keep twisting. You can see I can, as my icing scoots out the bottom, I can always keep tightening. And so that's why I never recommend folding the bag over, although you will see a lot of people do that. So what we're gonna do is just a nice little swirl. This is our lemon poppy seeds. So you have two options. You can start from the outside and work in to get that little almost like ice cream top, or if you want it to lay a little bit more flat, then you start from the inside out. And the other option is you have to decide, do you want to cover your entire cupcake in icing, or do you like just that like little dot at the top? And some people even like to just kind of make one little like piece of icing. So it's really about what you like. A lot of times it's also about how nice your cupcakes look. If you're trying to hide something, then you want to cover them. This is not a super sweet icing, so it's not a big deal to cover it. You're not going to be overwhelmed with the sugar. So we're basically going to start right at the edge, and I'm just going to work my way around. When I end, I let go of the pressure on my bag, and then I lift off. Okay, and so as you'll see, we have ourselves a nice little swirl of icing on the top of our cake. Now, unfortunately, I do not have any sprinkles or any icing sugar or anything in my house. We are all out, so these are just gonna be kind of plain, boring cupcakes, but they'll still taste delicious, right? So if we started in the center, not quite as easy. This icing is a little thin for this, but again, same kind of thing, but it lays a little bit more flat. You don't get as much volume. As you can see, you get a lot more volume on that other cake. So my personal preference is starting on the outside, working in. I had a little bit more trouble actually getting to fit as well, so. And again, you'll notice I'm not even using my second hand right now. I'm literally just squeezing with my one hand and then releasing. And then again, see how I twist? I tighten, that gets the pressure up, and this hand just kind of squeezes. You can see that I've gotten down to the end of my icing bag. Typically what I would do is start a new icing bag because it's really hard to refill an icing bag once you've done that. Sometimes you can kind of sneak it and do it, but some of the icing kind of creeps up top and it's much harder to get that fold. But since I don't have any other icing bags here at home, it's the only one I have, I'm gonna try my best to refill this one so that I don't have to wash it and rinse it and kind of start over. So I'm gonna very carefully fold this edge back down again. Try not to make too much of a mess, and we're gonna refill. Oops. So once again, I'm gonna flop that edge down. Unfortunately, I've got a little bit of a mess going here, but I'm gonna try my best to kind of keep it. If your hands get greasy, you're never gonna be able to grip the bag well, and you're not going to be able to squeeze, and you're not gonna be able to ice, and you're gonna be very frustrated. So if the exterior of your bag does get greasy or full of icing, or your hands get greasy or full of icing, you definitely want to wash them and try to wipe off the outside of the bag as best you can. All right, so here we go. Whoop! Look at that, my icing is already starting to slop out. So we're just gonna go with that little bit there and cover it up. And last but not least, so there you have it. So that recipe that I made frosted all 12 of these cupcakes. We've got our lemon poppy, our red velvet over here. We don't have enough room on our plate, and our Oreo. So there you have it, guys. 12 frosted cupcakes. We've got a little bit of leftover icing, so you can sandwich it between some graham crackers, just eat it, or find other creative ways that you might be able to use it. So thanks again for watching. We really appreciate you joining us. Hopefully you do some experimenting with flavors on your crazy cupcakes, and I'll get to see and hear all about it in your work. Bye-bye.